We, the jury, in the above entitled matter as to count 1, unintentional second-degree murder while committing a felony, find the defendant guilty. Third-degree murder, perpetrating an eminently dangerous act, find the defendant guilty. Second-degree manslaughter, culpable negligence, creating an unreasonable risk, find the defendant guilty.
All too familiar scenes as Americans call for racial justice and reform following another fatal police shooting.
This is a taser. But no, my nephew was killed with this, a Glock.
Hello and welcome to Inside America. I'm Ghida Fakhry. After 3 weeks of emotional and graphic testimony from over 40 witnesses, 6 white, 4 black and 2 multiracial jurors unanimously agree that Chauvin is guilty of second and third degree murder and second-degree manslaughter. Video footage of Chauvin with his knee on Floyd's neck for 9 minutes and 29 seconds sparked nationwide protests. The defense and prosecution made their closing arguments on Monday.
He was, in fact, following his training. He was following Minneapolis Police Department policies. He was trained this way. It all demonstrates a lack of intent.
You saw it when Mr. Chauvin did not let up and we didn't get up. Even when he passed out, not breathing anymore, he doesn't let up or get up. When he knows he doesn't have a pulse, he doesn't let up or get up.
It's what you felt in your gut. It's what you now know in your heart. This wasn't policing. This was murder.
As the jury started its deliberations, 3,000 National Guard troops and over 1,000 law enforcement officers were deployed across the city of Minneapolis and nearby Brooklyn Center following the police shooting of 20-year-old Daunte Wright. Wright, an unarmed black man, was shot by a white police officer during a traffic stop last week, just a short distance from where the Chauvin trial was taking place. Police officials said Officer Kim Potter accidentally shot Wright when she mistook her gun for her taser.
Oh, wow.
The officer, a 26-year veteran, resigned last week and was charged with second-degree manslaughter, which carries a maximum sentence of 10 years in prison. The victim's family are calling for murder charges. So what are the prospects for justice and accountability? I'm joined by Minnesota State Representative from Minneapolis, Esther Agbaje. Representative Agbaje, the Minneapolis police seems to be on high alert in anticipation for the verdict in the Chauvin trial. What are your concerns? What are your expectations?
Thank you so much, Ghida. It's great to be here. Yes, we are seeing much more obvious police presence across all of Minneapolis, but especially in downtown Minneapolis, which is part of the district that I represent and also where the courthouse is. I think a lot of that is there is anticipation of if there is civil unrest, we want to be prepared. At the same time, me and my colleagues have really pressed upon the police department, our state patrol, to really make sure that when we're engaging with protesters and people who are out there expressing their First Amendment rights or grieving, that they give them that space to do so. So therefore, there's less of an opportunity for escalation between both the police and the protesters.
Will these shootings stop unless there's a fundamental shift in policing and racial justice in this country?
No, as we've seen over the course of the year, we're not even at a year after George Floyd was killed, and we had another officer-involved shooting in December. We had this police shooting just last week with Daunte Wright. So we know that there needs to be more of a transformational shift in policing, and one court case isn't going to do that. And in fact, in Minnesota, we actually have had a police officer convicted of shooting a civilian, and we've seen that still hasn't changed anything. So we need to get at the heart of the issue, which is transforming our police department across the state, as well as investing resources in our communities.
How much of a lasting legacy will this case have for African Americans?
I can't speak for everyone, but I do think everyone sees that this is a first step for accountability, right? This is the first step to say, yes, we have seen a police officer act outside of the law, act outside of their duties, and we are actually holding them accountable to the systems that we have in place. I think that's a positive first step. But at the end of the day, what will actually bring about true justice and true changes, and I think in racial relationships across the United States, is ensuring that our Black and Brown communities are actually invested in, that we're supplying resources, we're providing better housing, quality education, making sure that people have training and access to living wage jobs, and that our healthcare systems are good. Because we're also, at higher risk of dying from COVID-19 in this pandemic because of the way our healthcare systems are set up. So justice and the racial reckoning has to happen across all sectors in our society, including the policing sector.
And as you mentioned, there was another shooting just a few days ago, just a few minutes away from the courtroom. 20-year-old Daunte Wright shot and killed by police following a traffic stop. According to the city's own statistics, 58% of the reported use of force by Minneapolis police between 2015 to 2020 was against Black people, even though just 19% of the population in the state is Black. That's 7 times the rate of force used against white people, and they make up 60% of the population. And as of 2020, only 9% of police officers in Minneapolis are Black. Would adding more Black officers to police predominantly Black communities help lower the number of police killings of African Americans?
I think it's always helpful to have police who are from the community be part of that community. So that way we're not necessarily having outsiders coming in and they don't understand the dynamics of the community. I think that can always be helpful. But again, it goes back to what is the history and the purpose of policing. And we've seen that even police officers of color are involved in the police violence and police brutality against other people of color. So it's not that simple. And I think it really just goes back to saying we have to think differently about what is public safety. Police cannot be our only answer to every social ill, and we really need to start looking holistically at what a community response is for community safety.
All right, Minnesota State Representative Esther Gbadje, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
And so while Minnesota deals with yet another deadly police encounter, thousands of protesters in Chicago are back on the streets calling for police accountability after the shooting of 13-year-old Adam Toledo. Body camera video released by an independent city agency shows a police officer fatally shooting the Latino teenager following a foot chase down a dark alleyway on March 29th. The video shows the officer calling on the boy to stop and drop a weapon. Adam Toledo drops what may have been a handgun. Just as he turns around with his hands in the air, the officer shoots him in the chest. Adam Toledo died in that alleyway. A harrowing scene, but what do these repeated images of deadly use of force by police officers tell us about policing in the United States today? Jason Johnson is president of the Law Enforcement Legal Defense Fund, a police advocacy organization. With 20 years in law enforcement, Johnson was most recently Deputy Commissioner of the Baltimore Police Department from 2016 to 2018. Jason Johnson, many watching the trial of Derek Chauvin were hoping that it would be a catalyst for change, that it would be an important lesson for police officers across the country. Instead, we are seeing more of the same, more shootings, more killings, often of unarmed Black men. Has anything changed since George Floyd's killing? Have any lessons been learned?
I certainly think lessons have been learned, but I also think that the George Floyd case stands sort of by itself in its own class of cases involving police officers, mostly because it was captured on videotape. It's very clear the interaction between police and Mr. Floyd, and even law enforcement officers, career law enforcement officers, are deeply disturbed with what they saw.
But the data does show that Black Americans are more likely to experience threats or the use of force by police. The rate is in fact 1.5% for whites. It's 3.8% for Blacks. There's a pattern, there's a discrepancy in policing, isn't there? And unless there is a fundamental shift in police culture, these statistics aren't going to change.
Well, police culture can always improve, and there's no question about that. I wouldn't debate that with anyone, that police professionalism can always improve, training can improve, and lots of other things can and will get better with police. I would challenge the way that statistics are viewed in police interactions with individuals who are members of the Black community versus the white community, because I think we look at them in comparing the representation in the population, but we don't even consider the fact that Blacks are far more likely to be victims of murder, far more likely.
But there is still this pattern. The website Mapping Police Violence tracks violence by police. Their numbers show that there have only been 3 days in 2021 where police officers didn't kill someone. And in fact, in 2020, there were only 18 days. If police keep relying on the use of force, won't we keep seeing these shootings and these murders? In fact, a lot of them occur after random, petty traffic violations. What about accountability and the importance of police officers being charged for the crimes they commit?
Well, again, you're presuming that the use of police force amounts to a crime. And in the overwhelming majority of cases, it is not a crime. In fact, it's a reasonable use of force by the police officer. And so just to say that there was a death involving a police officer doesn't tell the whole story. And I think to a large percentage of the public, unfortunately, the more they're exposed to the sort of sensational reporting of these cases, they presume that there was something wrongful. There was something wrong. There was a person acted in a way that gave rise to the need for deadly force by a police officer. No police officer wants to do that. We want to see those numbers come down. We don't want to see police officers using any force. But we have to deal with the reality, and we have to look at each individual case on its own merit and not make presumptions that the police officer did anything wrong.
And you also have the recent killing of Daunte Wright, who was shot after being pulled over. The police officer says she mistook her taser for her gun. A taser is an electroshock weapon that can also lead to death. Some are also calling for armed police officers to stop making these traffic stops, that too often they result in deadly violence. Wouldn't that lessen the chances of a deadly police shooting? And should a taser be involved in a traffic stop?
In the United States, there are a number of people, many people, probably more than there should be, who have firearms. Conducting a traffic stop is one of the most dangerous things that law enforcement officers do. There are just a couple of cases in the last week where police officers were shot on traffic stops. So the idea of disarming police officers on traffic stops is a complete non-starter. I think that, it's very unfortunate. This case of Daunte Wright, the death of Daunte Wright, is extraordinarily tragic and unfortunate. But again, we have to look at each of these cases on their own merit. We can't presume wrongful conduct by the police. We have to allow there to be a full, fair investigation, including due process, to determine what happened and whether what happened was a crime. And when there's a strong public reaction, prosecutors have a tendency to bring charges immediately before an investigation can occur. And that's what happened in this case.
But you do say it's unfortunate and tragic. Some, though, believe that there are two systems of policing and justice in this country. If you look at the way some violent white supremacist mobs were handled by police on Capitol Hill, the fact that the Oath Keepers, the Proud Boys, other armed extremists boast about their close relationship with law enforcement. And if you compare the way that young unarmed Black men, or Latino men, in some cases boys, as we saw just last week, are being treated, there's a very stark difference, isn't there?
No, I wouldn't say that. I would say that, in fact, you raised the perfect case for me to use as an example of the Capitol. An unarmed white woman who was a United States military veteran was shot and killed by police. And in fact, there hasn't been any outrage about that case, even though the U.S. attorney has already announced that there won't be charges. There have been no protests. There have been no civil rights attorneys. BLM hasn't protested the Capitol for that. No member of Congress has called for the police officer to be prosecuted. So, yeah, I would say there is a difference, but it's slightly different than how you've represented it.
But take the case of Army Lieutenant Nazario, who is Latino and Black. He's suing 2 Virginia police officers for violating his constitutional rights after he was pulled over for a missing license plate. Here's part of the encounter.
You received an order. Obey it.
I'm honestly afraid to get out. Can I?
Yeah, you should be. Get out.
I do not have to get out the vehicle. You haven't even told me why I'm being stopped.
Really? Get out of the car now. Get out of the car.
I'm actively serving this country, and this is how you're going to treat me? Back up, Daniel. I didn't do anything.
Back up.
Whoa, hold on.
Daniel.
What's going on? Hold on.
Get out of the car. Get out of the car now.
Was this excessive use of force? Should the Army officer have been handled as aggressively, as violently as he was?
Again, police officers, I think there is room for improvement in training. There is room for improvement in our accountability systems for police officers. But you can't take one instance, no matter what happens in that one instance, and impute the same types of conduct to every police officer. There are 18,000 law enforcement agencies in the United States. They don't all conduct themselves the same way, and nor do any of the officers within those agencies conduct themselves the same way. So we address problems as they come up. We predict ways that we can improve policing and improve police training, and we should continue to do that. But I don't think we should demonize law enforcement officers based on the conduct of one.
But isn't that a classic example of racial bias? How do you train against it?
I don't think we can say that there's racial bias involved. If a police officer mistreats a person, all we can say from that one contact is that they've mistreated that person. To imply that it's because of race or any other reason, I think we don't have enough information on that to say that.
Jason Johnson of the Law Enforcement Legal Defense Fund, thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you.
So then, is it a case of just a few bad apples, or are there two systems of policing and justice in America today? To discuss, I'm joined by Professor Michael Eric Dyson, author of the book Long Time Coming: Reckoning with Race in America. You wrote this in your book, that millions of white people who couldn't have conjured in their worst nightmares the sort of brutality that black people encounter routinely now have seen clearly, you say, what you have all been saying for a long time. You also go on to say that, quote, now they understand the wanton brutality that descends on black bodies and turns them into fodder for the police force's bottomless appetite for black subordination. Many white people saw, finally, in Chauvin's despicable act, the corrupted character of so much policing that sees itself as serving and protecting white interests. These are harsh words. Is there a risk in suggesting that the entire police force is guilty of these deep-seated racial biases?
Well, I don't think those words are nearly as harsh as the realities we confront. They're not nearly as harsh as the incredible systemic injustice to which black people are subject. The problem is we've been too light, we've been too soft, we've been too feathery with police forces and white supremacy and white brothers and sisters who may be insulted or offended because our words are direct. Those words are direct, but not harsh. Look, when we look at the police forces, we got to stop saying it's a few bad apples. The bunch is pretty contaminated by this point. In time after time, city after city, event after event, by looking at this, look at what has happened during the Derek Chauvin trial, right there in Minneapolis, right there in Minnesota. We saw in Brooklyn Center, we saw a young black man, Daunte Wright, 20 years old, be shot by a policewoman and killed. We've seen a police lieutenant in Virginia stopped for no good reason and pepper sprayed as a result of the invidious incursions of these police people. So when it's a whole bunch, we got to stop saying it's isolated or it's one thing over here. I'm trying to say that we've got to rethink and reimagine policing in this country so that the good that has been done in the name of policing can be preserved and the negative can be wiped away.
So then how do you change this police culture that all too often allows police officers to get away with murder with very little accountability? With a law change the reality? What will it take?
Well, it takes all of that. It takes laws, it takes culture, it takes training, it takes constant intervention, it takes responsibility, and it takes police people being held to account. The Derek Chauvins of the world cannot get off free. They cannot walk away with a simple slap on the wrist. They must be held to account. And the only way that happens is if we get rid of this notion of qualified immunity, if the courts do their part, if legislatures do their part, if we don't give the police a carte blanche, and I mean that blanche, the white right to offend, to hurt, to insult, to damage, and ultimately kill black and brown and other poor bodies. When those things are done and police are held to account, we'll see a shift in practice here. It has been suggested by others that if the color of those who die changes, maybe the consciousness will too.
But so how do you get rid of this long history of implicit bias? When you look at the roots of policing in the United States, how much has the history of slavery and racism impacted where we are today?
Well, they are deep and profound considerations, and we can't get rid of that overnight, but we got to be able to address it. This is the problem when we can't even admit that we've enslaved people and that it was wrong. We haven't had a formal apology. We haven't had reparations. We can barely have affirmative action. America wants to do stuff and then get away with it, throw a rock and then hide its hand, pretend that it didn't do what it did. And when we talk about enslavement, that makes certain white people upset. My God, why do we have to talk about it? Let me get this right. You are the people collectively in this culture who have reenactments of the Civil War. You have books upon Abraham Lincoln and Thomas Jefferson and many other founding fathers and mothers. Great. We love history when it's not about holding people to account, when it's not about the things that were done that were wrong. Then why can't you people get over it? Why can't you stop? So until we get rid of the historical amnesia that clogs the arteries of our political destiny in this country, we will continue to suffer a kind of thrombosis of injustice that will challenge the body politic.
And of course, we know that police officers are often given the benefit of the doubt because of the potential dangerous situations they can find themselves in. But what is it like for young African-American men who face police officers today who are pulled over, often with no valid reason or for no explicit offense? What is it like for them?
It is terrifying. That has happened to me on many an occasion. What about the fear we feel? We don't have guns for the most part. We certainly don't have badges. We don't have the imprimatur of the state. We don't have the support of the government. We're not working officially in behalf of whatever particular county or city or state or country and municipality. So we have to be honest about the fact that everything is in the benefit of the police person. And why is it that they don't routinely, to the same degree, shoot white people? Why is it that white people can have guns, machetes, knives, and come at police people directly, steal their cars, and never held to account, never having a judge and a jury on the spot execute them? So we want what white folk get in Maine. We want what white folk get in general. We want what white brothers and sisters are given, the benefit of the doubt of their humanity, and that we don't have a desire this day to take their lives for petty infractions. Mr. George Floyd was stopped for what? A $20 bill that he may not even have known was counterfeit. Is this worth a man's life? This is the trauma and tragedy of being black in this country and being stopped by police capriciously and at will.
And according to the website Mapping Police Violence in 2020, 27% of victims of police killings were black, despite being only about 13% of the US population. How systemic is this problem? How much of a national transformation will you need to bring full accountability, knowing what the FBI has also warned for many years, that white supremacists had infiltrated police departments across the USA, that a data breach recently reveals that serving police officers have donated money to far-right activists and fellow officers accused of shooting Black Americans? What will it take?
It will take a wholesale transformation. That's why you see my words weren't harsh. That's why we need a systemic engagement, a systemic cleaning of house, not just a few people. You got officers giving money to Kyle Rittenhouse, 17 years old, accused of murdering 2 white men in Kenosha, Wisconsin, supporting white supremacy, white reactionary hostility toward Black Lives Matter and Black people. This is deeply ingrained. The very people that are watching the hen house are themselves the foxes. And Malcolm X says that when the foxes are watching the hen house, it ain't a good thing. And so we have to hold these people to account. We have to have real teeth in the oversight committees that look at police people. We have to decenter these police unions, and we have to decenter the central authority of police departments. Police are not the only people who are engaged in the practice of public safety. We have to make sure that people are equipped, and that maybe we need to think about taking away some of these weapons and these guns that police people deploy. But at the end of the day, we have to make sure that Black lives matter as much as other lives, and that the attempt to control and corral these Black communities doesn't end in their sacrifice on the altar of white nationalism, white supremacy. And let me end by saying this. Not only does the white nationalism invade these police departments, it's the biggest threat in America, but they suppress those reports looking for Black extremist groups that are virtually non-existent.
Professor Michael Eric Dyson, author of the book Long Time Coming, thank you very much indeed for sharing your perspective.
Thank you for having me.
While tensions between the police and Black communities in America are nothing new, the roots of racism in policing were planted centuries ago. From policing in southern slaveholding states aimed at controlling and crushing uprisings led by enslaved Americans, to slave patrols that lasted from the early 1700s until the end of the Civil War, the history of American law enforcement is deeply rooted in the legacy of slavery. So are the lingering structural, systemic racial biases in the policing system today. And so, in short, unless there is accountability for the death of an unarmed Black man killed in broad daylight under the fearful gaze of a helpless crowd of mostly African Americans, the troubled and often tragic relationship between the police and Black communities will continue. And unless there is a real reckoning with racism in the police and justice systems, following the brazen killings of George Floyd, Daunte Wright, and so many others who've died at the hands of white police officers, then nothing would have fundamentally changed since millions of Black and white Americans marched together last year, galvanized and united in their calls for racial justice. That's all from me, Fakhry, from the entire team in Washington. Thanks for watching.